So, Dezi Freeman was reportedly shot for a second time this morning after we had all of that debacle where he ran off into the bush and they used the Australian Defence Force to go chase him down and then went dead silent on the whole matter, and the media went dead silent. But remember how that cretin from the New South Wales Magistrate Court, David Halpin, came out and started pushing the sovereign citizen ideology everywhere on behalf of the ABC, the mouthpiece of the executive branch of government. You better get out there, Dave, and you better start defaming those Australian countrymen, because we need to keep them as debt fodder for our administrative trust. So today, we're going to go through a video. I don't like doing this stuff. I'm about to mock and defame the character of an idiot that is one of those usual know-it-alls that knows fuck all. So just bear with me, because this is going to be a microphone recording version, and it's going to take a while to put together because I've got a wonderful video to go through here to point out all the fallacies that are pushed by the Australian government and the police. The fallacies pushed by the police. But at the same time, we're going to demonstrate the incompetence of a lot of Australians that believe some stupid shit. Okay, so just bear with me, because we play on both sides of the fence here, and I will stand adamantly as I speak, because I have more experience in this than pretty much all of you put together. So bear with me. Right, so I've got everything set up. I've got a picture of a screenshot of the video to use while I'm paused and talking to you. I've got a picture of me in the corner that you already see there, and I've got a video to play that I'm going to pause and discuss as we go through it to demonstrate something very, very clear to all of you. And the very first thing I'd like to say is, these people that think they know everything about a certain thing don't actually know very much, because they're going on their academically trained mind, which is an ignorant mind. I'll just say that right at the beginning. So let's jump into this video and pull it apart for what it is. It's propaganda.
Dezi Freeman is dead. 7 months, Australia's largest manhunt, and it finished this morning in a shipping container. Police shot him. And every headline is going to tell you the same thing. The manhunt is over, justice is served, case closed.
Everyone thought the manhunt was over when the media pushed the ideology that the Australian Defence Force were called in to chase Dezi Freeman down. So what this demonstrates is that the Australian Defence Force can't chase a single man down through a bushland they're trained to operate in. It also demonstrates that the police have lied to you while they've kept under the cover of darkness and not openly admitted their failure, and they've murdered Dezi Freeman, who now no longer can speak up for anything, while they go through said shipping container, you'll hear in a minute, and take all the evidence and hide it behind closed doors.
But that's wrong, because Dezi Freeman wasn't really killed by police. He was really killed by an idea that is spreading right now in Australia, that tells people the law does not apply to them. And when people believe it, this is how it can end.
So Dezi Freeman was killed by an idea that the Australian government might not be what it seems. Just get that into your heads, everyone. He's setting this up in a way, like a lawyer. He'll admit that he's an ex-police officer and now a lawyer, and the ideology is what killed Dezi Freeman, not the fact that he might have murdered 2 police officers and was on the run for murder. The ideology that he got swept up in was the reason. Now, the police treated him in a very bad way in the first instance, which might have put fear into him, and we will discuss how incompetent Dezi is as we go through, but I want you to comprehend what he's saying is that it's an ideology. You can't think that the Australian government is a fraud, has something wrong at the core of it, is not what it seems to be, and we can discover what that is as we go through. But I'm just trying to set a picture on the table here that this guy's acting like he knows everything when he actually knows very little other than what his academia has laid down in front of him as the truth.
I've been a cop. I've prosecuted cases, and now as a lawyer I defend them. I've seen this ideology destroy people in real time. So let me show you what it is and what happens next under Australian law. Sovereign citizenship. You've probably heard the term.
Ooh, sovereign citizenship is when a government slanders you for an ideology that it's not prepared to discuss. Now, he's going to get into what it is as we move forward, but what I've come to realise is that they use this defamation of you, calling you a sovereign citizen, because you haven't figured out what is going on. You can't put it before a court competently. Now, I did a video on Dezi Freeman. It's called Lawtard. You can go through my videos and watch that, at which I describe Dezi Freeman as an incompetent litigant, which is the correct terminology here. You're incompetent at the law and therefore should be seen as that incompetent person rather than defamed as a sovereign citizen. That is the defamation that comes from the police themselves and the government. It is a label that has been put together to defame the character of anyone that questions the legitimate authority of the state.
Most people hear it and dismiss it as fringe lunacy, and legally they're right to, but dismissing it as lunacy is exactly what allows it to keep spreading. So I want to explain what it actually teaches, because you need to understand the internal logic of this ideology before you can understand why a man was prepared to die for it.
See how he's setting up the video to defame the character of Dezi, a lunatic at law, incompetent litigant, and saying that he was prepared to die for an ideology. Now, the only people that are prepared to die for an ideology are extremist militants like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Israel, those sorts of people that have some sort of religious fanaticism are willing to die for an ideology. Some incompetent litigant that could have been dealt with in a proper manner by police instead was used as an instrument by police and the government in a bid to bring people like this out to justify the murder of Australians on Australian soil by Australians. This is the legitimate reality of the situation that you're looking at. And this kind of person that you see in the video is totally okay with a police state being able to use murder to finalise a problem they don't want to deal with in a different way.
The ideology in its modern form originated in the United States in the late 60s. It grew out of a movement called the Posse Comitatus, an extreme white nationalist organisation with deeply anti-Semitic roots.
It grew out of a group called the Comitatus, a group from the 1960s. Now, a Google search would show you the reality. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, 18 USC 1385, a United States law, federal law, restricting the military's role in domestic law enforcement, prohibiting federal troops, i.e. the Army, the Air Force and the Navy, from acting as police, as it generally bans using federal military personnel to search, seize or arrest civilians, aiming to keep law enforcement under civilian control. Now, we must remember that the police here in Australia used the Australian Defence Force to hunt Dezi Freeman down. But this man attributes it to some group from the 1960s. Now, this was proven in a court of law to be police ideology, Australian state police ideology. They use it as a manipulation tool to put a tar and feather you.
The foundational claim was this: the legitimate American government had been secretly overthrown. A shadow corporate government had taken its place, and every citizen had been unknowingly enrolled into it. A legal fiction, a kind of slave state through their birth certificate. Now, the theory works like this. You are born and a birth certificate is issued.
Now, I don't want to go over this too much because idiots like this guy just refuse to even entertain the truth. America, during the Civil War of 1863, or ending 1863, saw the bankruptcy of America financially. The Rothschilds in London hedged their bets on the war. Now, from what I understand, they sent a man on a horse across the land to the port, and he got on a ship a day before the news was reported. Other people got on the ship the next day. And this one horseman managed to get word to the Rothschilds, who then were able to manipulate the money markets and collapse not only America, but the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland at the time. So this financial manipulation started to occur when Abraham Lincoln then introduced the Lieber Code, which is the United States Army's first Operation something 100, which defines occupation of a land and manipulation by military forces, which brought about the Posse Comitatus to restrict those military forces from doing policing on the American continent. This takeover of government was started in the Act of 1871, when that financial side of things manipulated the Congress to take over the executive branch of government. This is very important because it's not technically a military takeover, but it is a shadow governance. It is the manipulation of the executive branch, and we will get into that for Australia. But I want you to understand that this man has already lied to you twice.
That certificate creates a legal entity or a corporate version of you, written in capital letters, that the state owns and controls.
That the state owns and controls. They do. You are born in Queensland. The state of Queensland issues you with a birth certificate. They own and control that entity. That entity is then used by you to put things like land title in. It's attributed to your birthright, right? And your birthright is by allegiance to the state of Queensland. So he lied to you a third time. Now, he talks about this as a legal persona. He doesn't talk about the term personage. Now, that's a very important term when we come to some financial instrument holding you as a trustee when you're supposed to be a beneficiary. So he hasn't entered into the argument of trust law at all. He stepped into the incompetent viewpoint that this is all straw man ideology.
This entity is called the straw man, and the critical belief is this: you're the living, breathing, flesh and blood person. You're not that entity. You never consented to be bound by it, and therefore the laws don't apply to you. Courts have no jurisdiction over you. Police have no authority over you. Fines don't apply. Licenses don't apply. Tax doesn't apply. The entire apparatus of the state simply doesn't reach you if you know the right words to say, the right legal sounding phrases, the right paperwork to file, and the magic that sets you free.
And the critical belief is this: you're the living, breathing man of God, and the state creates all of these avenues to enslave you for a national debt that is equal to $1.1 trillion. Remember when Frydenberg said your children would be paying this off for the next 80 years? Is that not the definition of slavery? Now, I just need to pause here because I need to reflect back on the other things that he said. You never consented to be bound by your birthright as described in the Act of Settlement 1700. Now, a birthright, as compared to what he's saying, is a very different thing. At law, this is what's called a certificate of indemnity according to international law. And Australia is occupied under the Hague Conventions. If you ring DFAT tomorrow and ask them if they are obligated to the Hague Conventions, they will tell you, of course they are. If you look up the Codified Crimes Act 1914, which is the Criminal Code 1995, in Volume 2, you will see that they are obligated to the Hague Conventions. Courts have no jurisdiction, police have no authority. Well, under the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions, an occupying state keeps the current law and order internally and adds more law and order over the top of it. They have an obligation to keep the peace, and the magistrates and judges are beholden to those Hague Conventions, as are the police force. So it's a misnomer to say that they have no jurisdiction over you. It would be correct to say that the jurisdiction changes slightly because you know who you are with God. And that's a key important factor here, The blessing of Almighty God defined in the Constitution allows you to anchor yourself to the land, whereas these people operate nationally instead of federally. Now, I'm simplifying things way too much. I'm willing to debate this guy till the cows come home. I'm willing to do it on a video in front of an entire audience and prove the incompetency of this guy's research. But that's for another time. I'm just trying to simplify this so you comprehend the propaganda that he's pushing while, or I should say, instead of recognizing the incompetency of the litigancy that Dezi Freeman used. Dezi Freeman was an incompetent litigant. Comply. Be subordinate to the state instead of holding the blessing of Almighty God that saw the state as your public servants. And what he's saying to you is, you should serve your servants. And this is why they get away with the amount of legislation they create and change your country, especially at a federal level. The state's a little bit different, but at a federal level, you didn't agree to all of these changes to your country. You had no say in all of these things. Party policy overrides the ability for your local constituent, your local member, to act on behalf of the constituency that he represents. Now, they might represent a district in the country and they might have an electorate, right? And then they join the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party says, no, you'll follow party policy. We're all Zionists. We love Israel. You'll do the bidding of Israel, and your electorate will come second. And that's the problem with party policy, and that's the problem with employed long-term what's the word for your politicians that never leave and have never had a real world job outside of that parliament. Career politicians.
That's what Dezi Freeman believed. And before I explain why it is demonstrably, categorically, legally wrong, let me show you what that belief looked like in practice. Because in 2019, Freeman attended a Victorian court. Not as a defendant, he went there to perform a citizen's arrest on a magistrate, a sitting judicial officer in their own courtroom. In 2021, he lodged documents attempting to privately prosecute the then Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, for treason. He posted on social media that the only good cop is a dead cop. And at some point, he changed his legal surname from Philby, the name he was born with, to Freeman.
I get my information from the media and I speak it out wrong. Now, Dezi Freeman was a defendant. He was going through a court process and he didn't understand the steps of that court process that kept dragging out on him to the point where he got the shits with the court when the court should have dealt with him swiftly because of the demonstrated incompetence. Now, the other things that he states might be true, but what this demonstrates is that he's slightly correct and not correct. If he had have looked at the video of Dezi Freeman in the court, he would have realised that Dezi Freeman was going through a court process and was stuck in a position of discovery before the court could proceed. And the magistrate at the time, go and have a look at the Lawtard video, which details this very clearly, wasn't having it from Dezi Freeman. And that's when Dezi Freeman, in his anxiety, turned around and started going, I arrest you, and I arrest you, and I arrest you. And that's where he turned from incompetent litigant into lunatic before a judge. And that judge could have dealt with him like a child at law, or even worse, could have put him before mental health, where he would have had to have sat down with a psychiatrist. And this has happened to others in the past, where that psychiatrist has been unable to prove the fact at law and unable to speak back to the court. Now, if this had happened to Dezi, he would have been deemed slightly insane by that psychiatrist, and the court would have had to have dealt with that in a different process or a different way. And this is what I said at the beginning of the video. They didn't want that to occur. They wanted to push Dezi to a point of him snapping back at the state, so the state could turn on him and have an excuse to turn on him, and therefore chase him down with the Australian Defence Force, which demonstrated in America under Posse Comitatus 1824, if I can remember off the top of my head, said that the military weren't allowed to do civilian policing, but in Australia they seem to have created a way for the police to bring in the military in 2013 legislative changes. So we kind of have an introduction of ignorance from media, or some sort of internal process as a lawyer that he's misread.
He did not adopt this ideology like a hat, he rebuilt his entire identity around it. So by the time those officers arrived at his property last August, Freeman had spent years constructing an alternative legal reality in which that warrant, which was signed and issued by a magistrate and in accordance with Victorian law, was nothing more than a corporate document he had the sovereign right to refuse.
Dezi had built up a whole entire Facebook group of Get Out of Fines group, and was sick and tired of the state, and this can be demonstrated by all the people that were party to this group, because they were trying to get out of fines imposed on them by the state, which is an act of slavery at international law. Now, let's be clear here, it's a financial burden or a burden of warfare put on you to revenue raise for a bankrupt state. Now, the whole warrant thing, yeah, fair enough. If you had have done something that was a crime, a criminal offence, then these people have a right under the Hague Conventions to uphold those internal laws. This is why judges and magistrates sit there, for the greater peace of the state or the country that at hand here. But he's now saying that you don't need to follow these things because they're corporate in nature. These things can be argued with a judge, but only under specific circumstance, because a crime is a crime. But under the Bill of Rights 1688, which applies in every state, right, let me just pull it up quickly. So this applies in every state. You'll find it in Imperial Acts Application Acts. In Queensland, it's the 1984 Act. It may differ slightly in your state. So the Bill of Rights 1688, 1 William and Mary, Session 2, C2, Section 12, grants of forfeiture, that all grants and promises of fines and forfeitures of particular persons before conviction are illegal and void. Are illegal and void. And that is part of your state's laws. It even applies in the ACT, which is the King's seat of government, a territory put aside for the federal government to be able to legislate for the federal side of the country. Now, this has been established through the foundations of law that existed long before the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution was even formed. Now, I'll repeat that all grants and promises of fines and forfeitures of particular persons before conviction are illegal and void. Well, what this means is that the police issuing you fines before you go before a court and are convicted are illegal and void. And this would apply to the council. This would apply to all those government agencies out there that like to issue you monetary fines called burdens of warfare in the type of a financial burden.
Now, why is this legally nonsense? Well, the foundational problem, and it is fatal to the entire theory, is this. The straw man concept originates from the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
The straw man concept, this whole ideology, relates to the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution. Now, I just quoted the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. I just quoted from the Bill of Rights 1688. We could look at the Act of Settlement 1700, which details your birthright. We talked about that birthright when he mistakenly talked about the birth certificate. So we also proved before a court of law in the Supreme Court that this whole entire ideology is not the ideology of people trying to get out of fines or act this way in Australia, because a lot of people in Australia know what American pseudo-legal garbage is. And to use the foundations of American law, like posse comitatus would be an example, but in the ideology of posse comitatus, you could argue that the Australian government should not be allowed to use the military as a policing unit like they did with COVID. Now, he's going to mention COVID into the video, but what I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that we have already put before you laws that apply to the Commonwealth of Australia. And that's what I'm trying to say to you here. The constitution of your own country is very key to you comprehending what's going on in your country.
An amendment passed in 1868 to grant citizenship to freed slaves after the American Civil War. It has nothing to do with Australia.
This is a misconception at law. The slaves weren't freed. They were emancipated. Abraham Lincoln said, "I will free you from your master as long as you take citizenship in my United States model." And this is where General Orders 100 comes into play, the Lieber Code. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a military force. He was the postmaster general of a military force that took over America. Now you're talking about the Civil War, 1860s through to 1863, 64, 65, wherein General Orders 100 were issued to his military, and they were the rules of engagement of that military while occupying America. Because you had the North versus the South. Now you need to go and read a little bit more about the Civil War. An Australian legal man here obviously hasn't done that reading, So he is reading from a textbook obviously issued to him at some point in his academia.
At all. It was never adopted here. There was no amendment. It doesn't appear in our constitution. It doesn't feature in any Commonwealth or state law. Australian contract law, property law, constitutional law, none of it recognises the concept of a legal straw man. It simply doesn't exist in the jurisdiction. So when sovereign citizen arguments have been raised in Australian courts, and they have been raised repeatedly, courts don't engage with them. They dismiss them because there is nothing to engage with.
Now, I should add, this becomes important to you as Australians due to the Nationality and Citizenship Act 1948. You were removed from your rightful position in the Constitution and put into an administrative trust agreement as a debtor. The International Monetary Fund Act 1947 was installed the year before, and as Australians became poor and dependent on the government, borrowed money, and the International Monetary Fund was a rehabilitation fund that Australia has never got out of. It is constantly being rehabilitated, and citizens are in disagreeance of your constitution, as can be seen at section 144 of the annotated Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia by Quick and Garron. This is then backed up by section 125 of the same annotated constitution.
The legal architecture that the ideology is built around has nothing here. There's nothing for it to connect to.
We just gave you that answer in that you are not citizens. Citizens are of a republican form of government. This is very clearly spoken about in the annotated constitution at section 114. There are other sections through that document, it's a rather large book, that detail this ideology as being an American ideology because they are in fact a republic. Now, the Liberals have pushed a republic on you since 1946. That must mean that the IMF Act has something to do with acting like a republic, and that has something to do with the term democracy. A democracy is a republican form of government, and you will see your politicians throughout the country tell you this country is a democracy, when it is in fact at law a constitutional monarchy and not a democracy.
Freeman took his arguments to the Victorian Supreme Court in 2024. He lost, not on a technicality, but because the argument has no legal basis. So this ideology was built for a different country, a different constitution, and a different legal system, but it arrived here carrying the foreign DNA. And the people who sell it don't tell you that. And the people who believe it don't know.
Now, he makes a good point here in that people are dumb. People are dumb as fuck. And he makes a good point that fools try to sell fools information, and then fools believe information, and then that pushes forward an ignorance which leads to you being an incompetent litigant, like Dezi Freeman demonstrated, and how I demonstrated that in the Lawtard video. But I remember sitting down with Barry, a guy from Melbourne, hi Barry, a long time ago, and we sat in the Supreme Court Library of Victoria and went through a whole bunch of documents for hours and hours on end. We even opened up the Justice's private cabinet and read documents like the Commonwealth of Australia Bill before it became an act. We also read documents relating to that constitution that were hidden in the judge's cabinet, a private cabinet that was locked, that just seemed to be unlocked on the day that we were there. Now, with total respect to the Supreme Court of Victoria Library, we acted like researchers, and we spent our time very competently going through documents with respect and put all those documents back in that cabinet. And we witnessed a lady open a door where there were very, very old textbooks behind closed doors that they had access to. And I'm talking books that look to be 500-600 years old. The basic premise here is you can't teach an idiot, for he will always be an idiot.
But here's what I actually want you to sit with, because it's the obvious question, the question most people ask. Who believes this? Who looks at this theory and says, yeah, that's real, and I'm going to rebuild my life around it? The answer isn't who you think, and it matters enormously for what I'm about to tell you. So here's something really important for you to understand. Freeman's nephew, speaking to the Sydney Morning Herald in the weeks after the shootings in August, said this. He described Freeman as always trying to find a place or a group where he could fit in, and that Freeman was always upset that everybody seemed to have something better than him.
The obvious question, who gets involved? Well, he kind of alludes to this as we go through the video, but people get bankrupted by the state on purpose. People get manipulated by the police on purpose. People watch their livelihoods go down the drain and try and fight for those livelihoods, which might mean looking through any avenue of law to retain those livelihoods before they go down the gurgler. Now, as the financial problem in Australia grew over the last 3 to 4 years alone, and the price of a house went through an astronomical increase to the point where your youth and your children can't afford to even buy or rent a home in the land they were born in, they start to question the reality of the governments of the day that dictate their lives. And when you see a government go to war, just willingly go to war on behalf of a foreign power, you start to question their legitimacy as government. Now, Albo went to war on behalf of America, who went to war on behalf of Israel, and then Penny Wong spoke about Iran attacking people in all the countries around Israel, and I will point out that Iran didn't attack those countries. Iran initially attacked United States territory in those countries. But the point here is who gets involved in that stuff? People that have their livelihoods threatened in a country they believed was fruitful and turned out to be slaved instead. Now, the sad part here is that I always argued with Dezi year after year, telling him to open his eyes to what I had discovered while working for a council. For working for a council in Australia that was relative to your land titles and different to what you may have learnt in that they're related to your mortgage. This was much more concerning in relation to who managed those land portfolios. What is your council when it no longer operates under a coat of arms and now operates under an administrative corporate logo, and the key word there is administrative. Now, Dezi always argued with me and wanted to go his own way. So the nephew speaking there might be relative to Dezi not being knowledgeable enough to open his eyes to the way of the truth, and instead wanted to find his own way, which negates from the truth.
That's not the description of a monster. It's the description of a lonely person. A person who's cycled through environmentalism, heavy metal, devout Catholicism, conspiracy theories, always searching for a community, always on the outside looking in. And then the sovereign citizen movement found him, and it gave him exactly what he had been looking for: purpose. A framework for his anger, an explanation for why the system hadn't worked for him, and that he had not failed, but that the system itself was a fraud. And the community of people in this arena agreed, and that there was a community that existed and a sense of power in a life where he had felt powerless.
Now, Mr. Lawyer here already mentioned the term anti-Semitic, and now he starts to defame all these other movements, including Catholicism, a religion, and not an extremist religion like Israel's Zionism. He's trying to point a finger as to why Dezi Freeman's doing what he's doing, and Dezi Freeman's whole initial grounding was in stopping police from issuing fines to people and putting them into a burden financially, because the police always attack the poor, and the poor can't afford those fines and constantly get pushed further down. And when that breaches out into a greater society, you then can't afford your rent or your food or your fuel, while these monsters of the state continue to financially burden you. So he's trying to find a reason, and his reasoning is that an American pseudo-legal garbage found Dezi when Dezi was looking through all avenues to help people get out of fines, where he had felt powerless. Now, what if there was an actual fraud going on? And power comes with responsibility. And what if Dezi Freeman was irresponsible, which led to incompetent? Now, before we get into this next bit, he's going to talk about an academic. Now, I've already demonstrated, you can go through some of my older videos, I think I put them in a playlist called Glass Ceiling, which was a whole series of videos directed at the academic world to demonstrate that there is a glass ceiling of knowledge where they are brain trained to only be educated under that glass ceiling, which leaves them ignorant of many things that they have failed to discover while in their academia. So that's just a plug. Go and have a look at the videos Glass Ceiling. I think there's about 20 of them.
Professor Josh Roos at Deakin University studied the radicalization pathways into this movement. He identifies 3 structural conditions that create the entry point. First, regional inequality. The people most vulnerable to this ideology are disproportionately in rural and regional Australia, communities that have watched young people leave, housing that has become unaffordable, jobs that have just disappeared. People who felt that the system, the governments, the courts, the banks have not just failed them, but actively taken their life from them. The ideology doesn't create that grievance, it arrives and it validates it.
The problem with this argument is that you can't afford a home in a capital city called Sydney for less than $1 million. Now, you can buy a shack, a crappy wooden dilapidated home in Sydney for over $1 million. So his ideology that it comes from rural areas where their children leave for better prospects is a misnomer now that the RBA dollar has somewhat collapsed at the behest of consecutive governments in Liberal and Labor in their expenditure and their inability or their lack of managing the administrative trust under the Hague Conventions, at which they're obligated to, at law, to maintain. Now, if they fail to maintain those assets, it could be said that they have done it on purpose, and this is now encroached out into capital cities where you are having trouble finding somewhere to live, and then therefore have trouble finding a job and upkeeping a lifestyle that your parents were used to and you can no longer have. Now, what if this occurred in those regional areas first? And there was somewhat a seeing that the police were treating them unfairly and that the state government and federal government did not care about them, and there was something behind it that was causing this to occur. And this is where he blames it on a sovereign citizen movement, and this comes from a professor at Deakin Academic University pushing an ideology on students, a glass ceiling, dumbing them down to believe things that may not be true based on research done by said professor who has blinkers on while he sits in a job well paid while living in a region of affluent people.
Second are the trigger events. This is almost always a specific moment: a divorce, a job loss, a financial collapse, a debt enforcement, a custody battle, some direct, personal, painful collision with the legal or financial system that creates the opening. And at that moment of maximum vulnerability, the movement is there. Online, with answers, with a community, with a framework that says the system did this to you, here's why, and here's how you can fight back.
Oh, what a bullshit argument. A divorce. Every one of these things that he mentioned is financial in nature. And these are the kinds of people that are so pushed down they can't afford to go and get a lawyer to help them fight against it in a court of law. Therefore, try and become the lawyers themselves and aren't competent enough to go through all the legislation which increases every year to the point where we're bloated with legislation that no one can actually fathom anymore. And this is where lawyers who believe they know everything also fall to their knees because they're bloated with legislation they have to keep up with year after year after year. So this is a false ideology coming from the professor at Deakin University because he's looking for an answer that isn't there. The answer is in front of your face. A state government creates legislation on a regular basis but never repeals the legislation that came before it. Now, if you were to look at the legislation across Australia, it was very simplified in the 1970s. And now when you fast forward to the 2020s, you're dealing with a library of legislation that even lawyers have trouble going through, which is why some very competent lawyers fall to their knees in a court because they don't comprehend or understand the position that they've been put in by the other side. The other side's lawyers might know things that you've disregarded. So these trodden down people start trying to become lawyers themselves. And this is where his previous statement about stupid people, well, this leads to them looking on places like Facebook, which is infiltrated by police officers that push this false ideology around. And I can attest to the fact that there are police officers in the fixated persons units in your states that sit on Facebook all day, every day, pushing this ideology around so that you fall into that trap and then get called someone reliant on pseudo-American legal garbage when all you're trying to do is become a legal representative of your own affairs and failing in that process to do so.
And third, and this is the big one that changed everything in Australia, COVID. The convoy to Canberra in 2022 was an inflection point. For the first time, large numbers of Australians who had never previously experienced the law as a coercive force experienced just how forceful the law can be, directly. Mandates, lockdowns, checkpoints, fines, and online, waiting for them, were the sovereign citizens. With a ready-made ideology, with a ready-made explanation, anti-vaccination communities, anti-government communities, and sovereign citizen communities fused that, and the movement grew faster than any previous point in Australian history.
Oh God, it gets worse. Because now he's attributing the gathering of groups together that are dissatisfied with their public servants treating them like slaves, poisoning an entire population, which is where forced medical procedure and medical experimentation form criminal offences under the Criminal Code Volume 2. What the Australian government did to all of you was in fact a war crime, a literal war crime. And when they locked you down, all these groups came together because that Australian government forced you into your own homes, refused to let you go to work while their companies remained open. Their creditors' companies remained open, while all your businesses were forced into collapse and failure, while the police roamed the streets like Nazis and fined you for being out of your area, treating you like prisoners in your own homes instead of treating you like the men and women of a society under some sort of medical emergency. No one saw a pandemic, and post-fact, no one's held these war criminals to account. But the reasoning of this professor is that your dissatisfaction with the way you are treated by the state caused you to congregate together looking for answers as to why you were being treated like prisoners of war in a situation not unlike the Nuremberg trials. Now that's an important key moment in history that sees the Criminal Code 1995 include those war crimes such as forced medical procedure. Now, when it comes to Dezi was doing that for 10 to 12 years, long before COVID, and actually did help a lot of people get out of fines. And that's never spoken about because Dezi is a sovereign citizen pushing around American pseudo-legal garbage and not arguing constitutional law, state constitution, or English historical law in any way, shape or form. Then why did a lot of people throughout that Facebook group have success in having their fines quashed? No one ever addresses that because the propaganda must defame Dezi.
So even right now, there are Facebook groups dedicated to this movement with 25,000 active members in Australia alone. There are people selling online courses that claim to teach you how to defeat fines and walk out of courtrooms and assert your sovereignty. It's a commercial ecosystem built entirely on a legal lie.
So there are tens of thousands of people that are dissatisfied with the way their public servants, who are supposed to serve their Commonwealth, treat them like the servants to their public servants. And that's only going to grow in number as the finance situation in your country under the Reserve Bank gets worse and worse and worse because Trumpy boy dragged the entire democracies around the world that they sold democracy to through their IMF into war. The oil problem's going to get worse. The oil deliveries to Australia may turn around again. Farmers in this region have to wait 3 weeks for diesel, which means they can't farm their properties, which means you don't get things like avocados or sugar or macadamia nuts, or all these things that are grown around. Peanuts is a big thing in this region. So all those things you won't be able to find in the supermarket, and that's why this grouping gets larger and larger and larger and larger over time because they're dissatisfied with the way their public servants run. Now, he pointed out people selling information. I've never sold information. I've never, ever even sold a flag. I've educated you on your foundations in your constitution so that you can uphold them. Jesus said, we didn't come to break the law, we came to fulfill it. Now, if you've got a silver dollar in your hand, you are richer than the entire government put together because it is $1.1 trillion in the red, and the GDP of the country and the economy will not allow them to get out of that red position for up to 80 years to 180 years. This means that the entire system is running on what's called financial fraud. Now, it's a bit different to you at home. The government is allowed to get away with some sorts of monetary manipulation because it's a country and not a person, a natural person according to the state laws. But we have this problem of people selling information. Hi Dawn, you're the one that took all of my data and pretended you knew it all and then went on and sold it along with that group called Commonwealth Custodians, another group that sell you data, and all you're doing is making the people at the top of that Ponzi scheme money while the people at the bottom of that Ponzi scheme get taught false pseudo-American legal garbage. And this is the problem. They become incompetent litigants. They try to use information that's peddled by the police on platforms like Facebook, and they end up before the courts dragged in there by those police and end up being in a position worse than they started off in. And this is because they're incompetent litigants. They haven't done the research to know Australian law and the foundations and line of authority that gives those judges authority to sit on a bench. Now, I remember in 2012 telling a judge to identify himself, and he refused and ran out the back of the courtroom and didn't want to deal with the question, who are you? Who do you represent? Show me your identification. What gives you a right to sit behind the bench? What is your line of authority? But the incompetent litigant isn't capable of doing those things because they are not well researched in the foundational law to the Commonwealth of Australia that is born out of English law, or the Westminster system.
And 6 weeks ago, in February of this year, 2026, the Lowy Institute published a report that should have been front page news. They found this movement is now active in more than 26 countries, and they described it, I'm using their exact language, as an escalating national security challenge, requiring multilateral intelligence coordination between governments. That report was published 6 weeks before this morning. Now, here's what I want you to understand about where this ideology came from, because it matters. It originated in America, white nationalist movements in the 1960s, and then it spread, and this is the critical vector, through English-speaking common law countries. Canada, the UK, Ireland, New Zealand, and us, Australia. It's spread through countries that share a legal heritage because the ideology works by distorting common law concepts, and those distortions travel along the lines of our shared legal DNA. In Canada, it became known as the Freeman on the Land movement. Dezi Freeman didn't just adopt the ideology, he adopted the name. He literally renamed himself after the ideology. A Canadian variant of an American ideology now operating inside Australian law that it was never designed for and has no application to. It is a foreign pathogen in a legal system it was not built for. The FBI have formally classified sovereign citizens as a domestic terrorist threat in 2011. ASIO has named the movement in its National Threat Assessment in 2022. The AFP have internal briefings. The Lowy Institute is calling for multilateral coordination. And yet, most Australians haven't really paid much attention to this movement because it is ridiculous and it seems ridiculous. Most Australians hadn't heard of Dezi Freeman until 2 police officers were shot dead. But the important message here is not that this was a once-off. It's a symptom of a greater disease.
Listen to what he said here. It's a national security threat. A national security threat. It's a threat to the government. It's not a threat to the country, which is federal in nature. The national part of the country is the government. So it's a national security threat to 27 countries. And he's relied on American definition of a terrorist organization. We'll get into that in a second. But the fact that 27 countries banded together must mean that this threat is more than a threat to the judicial process. Now, the incompetent litigants constantly wasting the judge's time is a threat to the judiciary, not national security. That's a state cost Those judges are paid to sit behind benches, and if they waste their time, they can't deal with court cases in a succinct and straightforward manner. They have their time wasted. But why is it a national security threat to a conglomerate of countries wherein the one that led it all is calling them terrorists? There might be some common thread, like a reserve bank system tied to the City of London and that family called the Bower family that started Bank de Rothschild. This might involve Lloyd's of London. This might involve the HSBC and JP Morgan and Chase. This might involve the people that run your economies in the bankruptcy of your country, and one only needs to read the Currency Act 1965 to comprehend that you are bankrupt and under administration and perpetually kept as debt slaves by the use of a liability called a reserve bank note. Now, the terrorism part and the unfortunate reality for this idiot in the video is that this was already tested before the Supreme Court of New South Wales when Ewa Kiskonen was accused of operating for a terrorist organisation, at which the justice determined that that was impossible. Literally impossible to defend your constitution and be a terrorist at the same time. Now, to be a terrorist against a bank administration run by financiers or a banking cartel that keeps your economy running might be a reality. If you terrorize those that have you under administration, you are now in the Hague Conventions, administrator under the rules of usufruct. So the unfortunate reality for the fool in this video, his ignorance is speaking very loudly, because I could bring up King via Casement 1917 and compare it to the terrorism charges that we were accused of directly. There is a correlation between King via Casement and the Kiskonen case in that documents were produced and a flag was consecrated in 50 country towns and 9 major cities, including every capital city across the country. If doing that was not terrorist in nature and was recognised under the Hague Conventions, there must be some reality in the fact that this national security threat is a threat to the banking cartels that hold your country in that financial administration. And this is why those fines and the Bill of Rights 1688 come to play, because the Bill of Rights said no fine or forfeiture, right? Grants of fine and forfeiture. And we discussed that earlier in this video. But what I'm pointing out to you is that acting in your constitution under the blessing of Almighty God was already accused of being a terrorist organisation and proven to be a false ideology on behalf of the police that tried to push the American pseudo-legal garbage ideology into the courtroom, only to be faced with Australian constitutional law and the English law heritage that makes it stand up in the first place. I don't want to go too far into that in this video, but I do want to impress on you that this national security threat is technically a threat to those administrators that hold you in debt slavery by using a liability called a reserve bank note. Now, you can go and do your own research, but don't turn into an incompetent litigant in the process. There is a lot of background knowledge here in ancient English law that sees the foundation of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia exist in the very, very first place. There is also a link to war and international treaties that back up this principle. So it is a long and arduous education, and that is the reason why you are being defamed as sovereign citizens, because a lot of you end up on Centrelink and dependent on the state. I'm trying to wrap as much as I can into a short amount of audio.
So I want to go back just quickly, if you'll bear with me, to the 26th of August. 10 police officers arrive at a rural property in, and I'm going to mess the name up, Popunka. They have a search warrant. It relates to historical child sexual offences. It's a lawful document issued by a court authorising these officers to enter and search the property. So what does that mean? A search warrant is a judicial authorisation. It's not a request, it's not an invitation. A magistrate, an independent judicial officer, has reviewed the stated grounds that the police have and determined that there is sufficient basis to issue the authority. So when police execute a search warrant at your house or your premises or your farm, they are acting under the direct authority of the court, of the judiciary itself. So your legal obligation in that situation is really straightforward. You don't have the right to resist it. You don't have the right to declare the warrant illegitimate based on your personal belief. You can't opt out of a court-issued authority because you've decided the court has no jurisdiction over you, and you cannot meet it with a firearm. Freeman believed none of that applied to him because in his worldview, constructed by the sovereign citizen ideology, that warrant was a corporate document from a court that had no jurisdiction over his sovereign self. So he believed he had the right to reject it, the right to defend his property against it, the right, in his own mind, to treat those officers as trespassers. I want you to understand what happened in the gap between his belief and the law. 10 police officers arrived doing their jobs, lawfully, with judicial authorization, completely unaware that the man inside that property had spent years building an alternate legal reality in which they had no right to be there. And on the other side of that door, a man who had been told by a cultist ideology, a community, by years of reinforcement that this moment was coming, that the system would come for him eventually, and that he was legally, morally, ideologically justified in what he needed to do.
Listen to the propaganda. Now, why would you need 10 police? 2, those police knew Dezi Freeman very well. Very well. They already knew his ideologies. Dezi Freeman appeared on A Current Affair, where A Current Affair entered his home and interviewed him and his family because he homeschooled children. He homeschooled his children. Now, child sexual abuse is very, very wrong. We know that from the Epstein files. No one ever questioned Kevin Rudd's position in those Epstein files. No one ever named the 27 politicians which were known pedophiles operating in the judiciary and the Australian government. So it's all right for those in power to escape the responsibility of their actions, but it's all right for the police to put together a warrant based on a truth or a falsity is unknown at this point to the rest of us, but it seems to me that after his current affair interview, where he was interviewed for homeschooling his children, that the police had a vested interest in stepping into that education gap. Now, the police should have asked for a warrant, in my opinion, for the way he homeschooled his children, and then the state could have considered that harm against his children if he was teaching them false ideologies. Now, the warrant situation, you could always argue later that that warrant is unlawful. That argument needs to be put towards the Supreme Court of your state. And I don't believe that magistrates should have the right to issue warrants. That should be done by the Supreme Court justices, who have a higher understanding of constitutional law than a police magistrate. I'll repeat that word, police magistrate. You are dragged before a magistrate usually because the police have put something on you. Now, if it were a criminal offence, then you could go through court process in your defence and bring up the crimes that have occurred and been enacted by those police. You could argue that warrant, but the clear fact of the matter is, if those police lied to a magistrate and gained entry to a property over false pretense, you're already behind the post in that they've gained access and are already going through your belongings, whether the fact of the matter is true or false. That then gets brought before a court, and generally under a criminal offence of such a high nature, you wouldn't be in a magistrate's court. The reason you're in a magistrate's court is because it is the police that are charging you, not the victim. Now, in America, we talk about American pseudo-legal garbage, but in America, the police don't typically charge people. They ask the victim whether they want to press charges, but in Australia you are nannied by the state and the police will charge you whether the victim wants to do that or not. So we're in this situation where they have invaded a property and you don't have a right to shoot at a police officer. We don't have castle law in this country, and that premise of defending your own property against invasion was questioned in Queensland recently, and it should be returned to the right of family to defend their castle against invasion, but the police have not invaded your home. They have knocked on the door and presented you with legal process, which you sort of have to adhere to, but can argue in a court of law as long as you're not incompetent at doing that. To give you an example, the police trespassed on a property I was on, and I charged a Queensland police officer and two of his colleagues for trespassing on that property, and won in the District Court of Queensland. The judge told me that my work was meticulous, meaning that I had followed every letter of the law, including those international laws that apply to an administrative force that uses the police as marshals or debt collectors. If those police had have turned up with a warrant, that would have been a different story, and that legal case would have taken an entirely different process. Whether Dezi pulled a gun is questionable. because we're talking about a state that is defaming the character of countrymen instead of educating them. And that's a key point that I would like to make. You are not being educated on constitutional law. Your government wishes that you remain dumb, subservient debt slaves, and if you were to learn your rights correctly, you would be challenging the actions of the state and federal governments and their politicians in a larger manner, which would see a lot more of those politicians go to jail for criminal offences that they have committed while under oath in public office.
The ideology put a framework around his violence, and it told him he was right, and it told him they were wrong, and it told him the law didn't apply. And 2 officers walked into that gap, and none of them came home. And here is where the story takes a turn that you may not be expecting. Dezi Freeman died this morning, and that means something very specific under Australian law, something most people don't know, and it changes everything about what happens next. So answer this question. What crime has Dezi Freeman been convicted of? The answer is none. Dezi Freeman died without ever facing trial for the murders of the 2 police officers. He was never charged. He never entered a plea. He was never found guilty. Under Australian law, as of this moment, Dezi Freeman is legally unconvicted. There is no mechanism in our system for a posthumous, after-death criminal trial. And when an accused person dies, the prosecution dies with them. The families of those 2 police officers will never sit in a courtroom and hear a guilty verdict read aloud. That's the legal reality. It is one of the hardest truths in criminal law. But here's what will happen. When someone dies in circumstances that are unexpected, violent, or involve police use of force, Australian law requires an independent investigation, not a criminal trial, a coronial inquest, conducted by a coroner, who is an independent judicial officer, whose function is not to convict or acquit, but to determine the full circumstances of the death, and critically, to ask whether anything should be done to prevent similar deaths in the future. A coroner has significant powers, the ability to compel witnesses, to examine government agencies, to scrutinise the conduct of police, and to make formal public recommendations to governments, to institutions, about what needs to change. Now think about what sits in front of this coroner in the future. On the surface, a police use of force incident. Was it justified? The Victorian Police Commissioner said yes. The coroner will examine that independently. That examination matters, but beneath that, and this is what I want you to watch, the coroner will have to confront a deeper question. Why did this happen? What series of events, what ideology, what radicalisation pathway produced a morning like that of August the 26th? And because Commissioner Bush confirmed this today, what about the people who helped him? Police believe Freeman was assisted during those 216 days. That people provided food, shelter, and support to a fugitive wanted for the murder of 2 police officers. Those people aren't protected by Freeman's death. They can be charged. Accessory after the fact, potentially in connection with the murders themselves. That investigation is active. The case is not closed. But the coronial, this is the one I want you to pay attention to. So as we discussed, the Lowy Institute 6 weeks ago called for a formal government response to the movement. ASIO has been watching it. Academic researchers are warning about it. And now, in the wake of 2 dead cops and a 7-month manhunt, a coroner has the formal authority to put the question on the record that no government has yet answered. Is Australia dealing with this problem? Is this ideology, this imported, legally baseless, increasingly violent movement being treated as the national security threat that it clearly is?
The violence part I don't get, because to date I've seen the police murder 3 different people that they have called sovereign citizens. Now, they camped outside this home for 3 hours, where in the years past they would camp outside homes for days on end, intimidating the people inside to give up. What caused the police to go and hunt Dezi Freeman down and murder Dezi Freeman in a short 3 hours this morning? That is a question that won't be asked by a pro-police state. Why was Dezi Freeman not given the right to speak for himself when he was in court in the first place? And why didn't a judge pick up on the lunacy that was being pushed before the court at that time and deal with it through mental health avenues that were open to those justices? There are a lot of questions that led to this murder by police. Now, it is unknown to all of us whether Dezi murdered 2 police officers. Some have been saying that those police officers were murdered by the very police themselves. So this puts a question into the entire incident going back to its beginnings. Is there a failure of the judicial system to recognise the incompetent litigant wasting the court's time? And should there be avenues for those justices to deal with those wastages of time? A free man is what all of you are outside of your debts. Your debts. And if you peddle around liabilities that cause the state and federal governments to remain in debt, are you somewhat responsible for all of this in the first place? If it is found out that Dezi was murdered by police and the police did not attend to a threat for a long enough time to be able to arrest him, it might indicate that they silenced him instead. And I'm not saying either way. I'm putting on the table the sheer fact that everything in this entire incident smells funny. There are parts of this where he could have been contained at an early stage and enlightened as to what was false and why he was incompetent. When he was in court in the Lawtard video, he was in a process of discovery, a step in the court where the judge only wanted to know what he was going to present to the court. And you heard the police prosecutor say, I've got all these witnesses, I've got this to talk to the court, I expect it to take about half a day. And all Dezi Freeman had to say at that point was, I've got this to put before the court, I've got this witness to bring in, I expect my testimony to take 4 hours, Your Honour, and bang, it would have been done and he would have been on his way. But he got entirely frustrated with the way that he had been dealt with over months, not just days or weeks. We're talking about months of the court pressuring and wasting Dezi's time, but at the same time, Dezi having to deal with his own incompetency. What I'm pointing out here is, did the police silence him on purpose? And that is a very direct question that I would put towards the coroner. If there is a coronial inquest, the question needs to be asked, why would they chase him down with the Australian Defence Force, and why would they murder him in a short amount of time this morning? These are very hard questions for you people to hear. And on the flip side, the justices of the Supreme Courts recognise what I've done to be non-terrorist in nature, which has caused the police to act differently around me. Hi, Chris from Nimbin. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Your colleague David was somewhat of a criminal muppet by the way that he treated that 17-year-old that day. I have been doing what I do since I discovered stuff in my job while working for a council in the Northern Territory. I put things before a Northern Territory court that saw a justice of the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory run out of the building. I put things before the Northern Territory court that saw a justice lie to the court, in which I went through something called an interlocutory application 6 times in a row. I was advised later that I am the only man in the Northern Territory to have ever pushed an interlocutory application more than 3 times. 6 times is the limit. And at the end of that 6th time, the justice said, "I'm the justice, I make up the law, what I say stands." And that says to me that justices are willing to lie to the court and uphold their lies regardless of the truth. And this is well known in the judicial circles of the Northern Territory. What I'm trying to impress on you is that the police are somewhat responsible for pushing American pseudo-legal garbage around, because we have caught directly Fixated Persons Unit New South Wales under the Anti-Terrorism Squad of New South Wales for sitting on Facebook pushing that ideology around themselves. We have pointed out in court cases that it is the police's ideology of American pseudo-legal garbage, while we defend our birthrights and the Constitution of this great country against foreign and domestic enemies to that Constitution. We have pointed out administrative trust and operating under the Hague and Geneva Conventions, which brings the COVID era around and the responsibility of these parties in government to the Criminal Code 1995 Volume 2, wherein they did practice medical experimentation. It is well known that Obama and a premier here stated that it was the largest experiment taken out across the world. That would mean that you have been experimented on with a poison forced on you as prisoners of war, while these police officers held you as prisoners in your own homes. There is a lot more that I could say, but we're trying to get to the end of a video wherein I have demonstrated the ignorance of this person who put this video together and his belief of the academic world, which can easily be rebutted before any Supreme Court in this country.
Or are we waiting for the next one? That coronial inquest could be the most important legal proceedings in this country over the next 2 years, not because of what it determines about Dezi Freeman, but because of what it could recommend about the movement that made him. Which brings me to what I want to leave you with, because this is not ultimately a story about one man in a shipping container, and it never was. The law in Australia is not a menu. You can't opt out of parts of it. You can't file a document that separates you from its authority. You cannot rename yourself in a way that places you outside of its reach. It doesn't matter what you believe. It definitely doesn't matter what Facebook groups are telling you or what an online course that somebody sold you claimed was legally true. The law applies. Full stop. And yet, and this is the part I can't stop thinking about, the people who fall into this ideology are not, in the main, stupid.
So you heard that, right? It doesn't matter what you think. You must be a compliant slave. Just get that in your heads. Your public servants get to push you around, and you must be a compliant slave. You can't go into a courtroom and challenge the system because you must be a compliant slave. Now, the ignorance of this guy in the video is astounding because he's a lawyer that defends his clients and is completely unaware of what a line of authority is in the matter. A line of authority comes through God, King, and country in your constitution. It's detailed in the preamble that states under the blessing of Almighty God, under kingdom, under constitution thereby established. Now, if you want to challenge the line of authority of a judge, it's not that difficult once you comprehend the state of affairs that your country is in as an occupied and hostile country under the Hague Conventions. This doesn't give you the right to shoot at police officers or argue warrants for criminal offences. This gives you the ability to challenge their lawful authority before a judge. It gives you the ability to question the judge's line of authority, because if he is outside of law, i.e. ultra vires, then he is outside of a line of authority and therefore at law cannot have authority. And this is a very key point that is missed by the dumb people on Facebook pushing around an ideology, and people like Dawn Kelly and Commonwealth custodians selling you false information in a Ponzi scheme so that those at the top of that Ponzi scheme profit from you at your expense. I have never sold any information ever, and what I have done is point out a fracture in the line of authority of this Australian government, and therefore the High Court and the Supreme Court judiciary and the oath they hold and the citizenship model that was forced upon you behind your backs. I can argue this very clearly before a judicial component in this country. We have pushed the federal government to comprehend that we know very clearly they are outside of a line of authority. This is why you have heard Albanese, Scott Morrison, Christian Porter, and a lot more people speak about the term rule of law. Rule of law is the Hague Conventions and the international world, because they are a vassal state to a foreign occupying power. And as citizens, you are citizens under Nationality and Citizenship Act and have given up your right to be subjects of the Crown. This is where the God thing comes into play, and the understanding of the foundations in your country therefore opening up the door to being able to question these people as to who they serve. Now, there's too much information to cram in a video where I am pointing out the failures of a propaganda pusher, an ex-police officer and lawyer who is in this system dealing with idiots every single day. I'm not having a go at him for defending an idiot, and I'm also not having a go at a police officer for maintaining the peace while under those Hague and Geneva conventions. What I am pointing out is that these police are obligated to international law because they are serving external powers that hold your country in administrative trust, making you citizens or debt fodder to that trust through the International Monetary Fund. This is a complicated situation that you need people to speak on your behalf, because you are now considered to be incompetent litigants at law and a threat to those banking cartels that hold your country in that administrative position for your bankruptcy that occurred in 1931. 1931 Financial Agreements Acts put you into debt with the City of London. This links you to Lloyd's of London and Bank de Rothschild, which might indicate why Israel has some sort of thumb over your national governance. This might indicate why the United Nations works the way it does, and this might indicate to you why Agenda 2030 has been planned and put into play over the last 30 to 40 years. That is an external power at which your public servants are obedient to, going against Section 44(1) of the Constitution. And my main point here is you are capable of holding these police, magistrates, justices, politicians, executive, military, and so on, nurses, doctors, etc. You are capable of holding them accountable for international criminal offences that they have committed on Australian soil, such as forced medical procedure or medical experimentation. This is where a police officer should be wary that there is a growing educated population that are not sovereign citizens and recognise their birthright as naked owners to that constitution under the blessing of Almighty God. And this is where the Bible, its unfortunate reality, the Bible actually demonstrates very clearly how they manipulate and occupy your country, and also gives you the answers on how to deal with that occupation. Jesus said, "We came not to break the law, we came to fulfill it." And what that means is we came to demonstrate a true line of authority, which then explains why these operatives in the state operate out of a fractured line of authority and are actually outside of law. This would put them in the position of the Hague Conventions, holding you as prisoners of war under those international rules of engagement. This is a complicated situation, and I'm not expecting any of you to comprehend it in full. What I am demonstrating to you very clearly is that the propaganda coming out of this man's mouth is because he is an uneducated muppet himself.
Freeman wasn't stupid. He was a man who felt the system had failed him, who found a community that validated his anger, who found a framework that gave him an explanation for his pain and a sense of power and a reason to keep fighting. The ideology did not create his anger, it weaponized it, and then it pointed it. This is what makes the movement dangerous. Not that it convinces people of stupid things, but that at the exact right moment, the moment of maximum vulnerability, it offers something genuinely hard for people to resist. The feeling of power in a life where someone has felt utterly powerless. Freeman changed his name to Freeman. He didn't adopt the ideology, he built an identity around it. And that should tell you something about the nature of what we are dealing with. This is not a hobby. This is not a substitute for meaning. And as it grows, as 25,000 Australian members become more, as an online radicalisation accelerates, as the movement fuses with other anti-government forces, the violence will not stop. The Lowy Institute, ASIO, the AFP, researchers at universities across the country, across many countries, they are all separately arriving at the same conclusion. This movement is escalating, and Australia does not yet have a coherent national response to it. I hope the coronial changes that. I'll be watching it, and I'll report back on this channel when it does. Two families are missing something tonight. Neil Thompson and Vadim Devort went to work on a Tuesday morning with a lawful warrant, doing their jobs, and they didn't come home. They were killed by a man whose belief system told him they had no right to be there. And that belief system didn't die today. It believes it has a martyr. It has a name, it has a community, it has a recruitment pipeline, and it will find the next person who is angry enough, isolated enough, and desperate enough to take the ideology to its own twisted logical conclusion. Dezi Freeman was not an anomaly. He was a warning. The question is whether anyone in power is listening. I'm James Glisson, and if you want to understand how power actually works in this country, I will see you in the next one.
Weaponized. Not by the gun that Dezi used to apparently or allegedly murder two police officers, but weaponized by your ideology, which becomes a threat to national security, with a large number of people starting to question the line of authority existing in the Australian government, and subsequently the executive branch, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the Federal Executive Council, and the Judicature. That means the High Court and all the Supreme Courts of state. Weaponized. A national security threat. What would happen if those tens of thousands of people realized the actual reality of being occupied by banking cartels and your economy being run in a debt which is actually a fraud at trust law? A fraud at trust law wherein an administrator under the rules of usufruct is obligated at law to maintain that estate. They have tried to undermine it with a republic, they have tried to undermine it with a voice, and they have manipulated your finances through Reserve Bank rates. They have manipulated your economy and driven you into poverty. What if all of that was siphoning your wealth out of you and was considered to be unlawful in accordance with the Hague Conventions? What if these people that feel threatened by this weaponization of law, some people call it lawfare and not warfare, because you are up against military force that occupies and controls your trade routes. Now, this coronial inquest will probably turn against you and recommend that the Australian government attack the Australian people, defame your characters by calling you sovereign citizens because you are dependent on their citizenship and therefore can't be freed into your right as a subject of the Crown. Now, when it comes to common law, this idiot doesn't exactly know what common law is. Common law is the common law of the family estate, of which you gave up when you became citizens and pledged your allegiance to the government of the day. You only need to look at the Australian immigration website and look at the citizenship pledge, which honours your subservience to a government instead of God. So help me God, as defined in the schedule to the Constitution itself. The Constitution demonstrates an oath of allegiance of which immigrants to your country are not under. They pledge their allegiance to the national government and not the foundations to your constitution. What if this large group of people suddenly realised that Dezi Freeman was in fact an incompetent litigant and had been incapable of standing before a court and holding a proper argument with grace? And what would happen if they realised people had already stood before those courts of law and demonstrated the reality in what I'm saying, in that they are not a lawful government, they are an administrator under the rules of usufruct in accordance with the Hague Conventions, and therefore outside of a line of authority. Now, remember when all of those politicians were put before the High Court because of their dual citizenship? What if the High Court was forced to recognise the annotated Constitution by Quick and Garron, which clearly defines at section 144 that you are not citizens and instead subjects of the Crown. Subjects of the Crown in a constitutional monarchy that cannot be a democracy, because in section 114 of the annotated Constitution, it clearly, very clearly defines a democratic form of government to be a republican model government. You are not a republic, although the Liberal and National parties have wanted you to be a republic for the last 80 years. You are a constitutional monarchy that was formed in the lineage of your Anzac, which is why Anthony Albanese has tried to undermine the line of authority established in your constitution and give it away to the Aborigine. An Aboriginal population that had sovereign tribal foundations before 1967 and were pushed into citizenship with the Australian government in 1967, therefore bringing them into line under nationality and citizenship under the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. This would make you all debt slaves to the banking cartels linked to the Financial Agreements Acts of 1931 and demonstrate biblically how you forgave your inheritance. Remember when Esau took the bowl of soup and then complained later that he was not inheriting when his brother had full inheritance? That is the sum of what you are looking at here. There are subjects of the crown that relinquish their citizenship, and there are people across Australia with birth certificates of state that are subjects of the crown of their state and not Australian citizens. Those states are countries in their own rights with constitutional governance in the states themselves. When those states united into a Commonwealth, you were still a Queenslander or a New South Welshman or a Victorian. You were not Australian citizens. They have gathered you all together in one pot to make you beholden to the national debt, while they hold national sovereignty determined by the United Nations and not federal sovereignty determined by your Anzac through the Constitution, which they spilt life and limb and blood for in defence of, so that you could retain it into the future. I'll close by saying that if a government for 80 years has attempted to undermine that Constitution from in office while operating under that Constitution, then they have committed criminal offence against the Constitution, because they are outside of office and outside of law, ultra vires in its respect, and therefore outside of a line of authority which can easily be established before any Supreme Court in the country. And once you comprehend this, you will be able to hold those to account for things like poisoning you during a COVID lockdown, a medical experimentation committed on you in a Nuremberg offence, which is upheld by the Criminal Code Volume 2, which makes every single nurse, doctor, police officer, army officer, senator, House of Representatives and executive branch government liable to war crimes for their participation in the largest experiment ever taken place on the Australian continent. So this guy in the video hopes that you get swept up and you get brought into line because his experience as a police officer sees him as the aggressor and the one that needs to make you compliant, instead of awaken you to the fact that you can hold these people to account. And that's what they fear. That's what they fear the most, which is why they look at it as a national security issue. A national security issue in the defense of those banking cartels behind them that have a thumb over them, that see them walk into international wars of aggression without the populace's vote. This is where you see Albanese doing the bidding of Israel very clearly by siding with Trump and liquidating your estate to pay for that war effort, i.e. putting you in more debt, a fraud against the Hague Conventions, which was there to maintain the estate, not liquidate it for their ventures into a control of the world by a single-handed banking cartel and its financiers, because you have to point now at the flesh and blood natural person that is responsible behind it all. So we'll leave that there, because the Australian government shouldn't be able to defame the character of its countrymen, nor should it be able to undermine your constitution, which it has attempted to do for the last 80 years, nor should it be able to commit war crimes when it is under rules of engagement. And this is a very serious thing here. They're worried that you will stop doing American pseudo-legal garbage seeded on you by the very police themselves and wake up to the Constitution under the blessing of Almighty God and find your naked ownership underneath it all and discover they are outside of law, meaning they are foreign occupying powers that are under those rules of engagement. They fear you waking up to all of this and standing in your sovereign right as God, King and country, which would demonstrate the fraud that they have perpetuated on you while they are obligated to the Hague Conventions. This would make them all war criminals susceptible to jail sentences or even loss of life for going outside of military rule that is over and above your domestic law. They are supposed to uphold your domestic law, like the Crimes Act 1914, like the laws of your states that existed before they arrived. This would make some of those laws void, invalid, and this is an argument you can put before a court demonstrating that anything that is of an administrator is not of your country and therefore could be seen to be invalid at law and could be demonstrated to be part of international law and therefore a war crime for going outside of those rules of engagement. Now, I don't want to repeat myself. This has been an arduous effort to go again and deal with the propaganda of the academic level of uneducated people. We already discussed this professor at Deakin University seeking for an answer and using his position in academia to spread a lie. And on a final note, hello ASIO, hello the Federal Police. We've had dealings in the past and they're well aware of who I am. They called me a person of special interest. Now, I'm not going to tell you what that means, but it's definitely not a person of interest. It brings on a whole new meaning when they realized I know what I'm talking about and can hold myself in courts of law and then are able to demonstrate very clearly that something is amiss and there is a fracture in a line of authority. They deem that person of special interest has some special meaning to those people at ASIO. Now, I would have joined ASIO a long time ago, but I since realised they don't protect Australians, they protect banking cartels that run Australia. And that's the unfortunate reality here. This is where we look at the defence of our country, wherein we are not defended, we are used to fight Israel's wars because the Rothschilds have a link to that Zionist system. This is why you can't speak about these people and you are defamed as anti-Semitic. And this guy in the video brought the fact up that this posse comitatus group from the 1960s, when it's actually law in the United States, is an anti-Semitic movement. And I point out that Australia is a Protestant country. It is not Catholic. It is not Zionist. It is not Jewish. It is not Orthodox. It is not Buddhist. It is not whatever Chinese people are. It's not all these different faiths around the world. It is born from Protestant roots in English law, forming a constitutional monarchy with a constitution at which the subjects of the crown are obligated to uphold. So defaming the people of the country for upholding their constitution is demonstrative of who's in control. And you've heard that saying in the past about who you speak about and get shut down for speaking about. They might be your masters. They might be the ones manipulating your government. They might be the ones using your children in their wars. They might be the ones responsible for Ben Roberts-Smith and his war crimes in Afghanistan. One must question why Ben Roberts-Smith was held to the Hague Conventions and those international laws, if they are the rules of engagement of a foreign occupying power that consider you to be the hostile state. Right, that was fun. So my last comment is, if you want to martyr Dezi Freeman, you are demonstrating that you're not a national security threat in my eyes. You have a mental health problem, and you are following down the path of being an incompetent litigant. And to those people like Dawn Kelly, Commonwealth custodians, and other people that have decided to monetize off selling information that is incorrect, I hope you eventually get charged by the people that you have sold false information to, and that you are held accountable for fraud, because you have sold them information that saw people get into trouble. Wayne Glue is the cause of over 20 people losing their homes for believing in Wayne Glue's false ideologies. The same could be said of Commonwealth custodians that have an internet portal where you can buy that information and feel secure in their little community, but then get squashed by a judge. And I will lastly say that a magistrate is not the place to make your arguments. Magistrates work for the police. They don't care about the situation that your country's in. It is the place of the district and Supreme Courts to have those arguments. So you might want to appeal your convictions with the magistrates' court before you bring up your constitutional arguments. Do not make Dezi Freeman a martyr. Dezi Freeman is an incompetent litigant. Dezi Freeman showed a lunacy when he demanded that he arrest all of these people when he was standing before a magistrate. I named 4 magistrates in the Supreme Court of Queensland and defined their criminal activity before a Supreme Court justice. If the Supreme Court justice thought or defined that criminal activity as bad enough to issue an arrest warrant would have been issued by that justice and those magistrates surely arrested. There is a certain limit at law where a justice is not going to arrest those magistrates and instead reprimand them for their actions and bring them back into line. And that is what happened with the police officer that I charged. He was taken off duty for a year to be retrained before he was put back on duty in the location that he was operating out of. I have also seen police be given weird promotions to remove them from the area in which I'm in, so that they are cut off from interacting with me because of their actions. You can't go and arrest a judge, a police officer. You could use an arrest by a private civilian, but that is very difficult when you're talking about someone under oath that has a right by that oath to operate in a certain way. You can point out their crimes and take those crimes in before higher justices and see those crimes dealt with, and you must rely on those justices to issue those arrest warrants at which those police would be obligated to follow. Regardless of who it is, there should be no fear or favour in the actions of the police. And once you get to the point of recognising your grace with God and how that God forms structure into your constitution, you would have a better chance of standing before a justice and proclaiming criminal actions have occurred. So my last thought here is Dezi Freeman is an idiot, or was an idiot. He has been murdered by police to shut him up. He probably has things that he's documented over the years that the government doesn't want you to see, and the police have been used to silence. I'm questionable as to whether he did fire upon 2 police officers, or whether those police officers were murdered in a Port Arthur-style false flag merely to silence Dezi Freeman. He should have been dealt with as a mental health patient, and the justice in the first instance should have recognised this and should have brought that up into the courtroom to initiate process into that mental health. That would have alleviated or stopped the anger in Dezi Freeman after they stuffed him around for months before those incidents occurred. His court trial should have been expedient and dealt with in a swift and clear manner, whereas they allowed that to go around in circles, believing they were stuffing him around when they were actually creating the monster that he became, allegedly. So it will be interesting to find out what goes on into the future and whether David Halpin reappears on the ABC selling his sovereign citizen ideology and American pseudo-legal garbage in the defamation of those that stand up against the state. Hi, David. You're a war criminal. That's why you were removed from the bench in a mental health incident. You went a little bit crazy when you found out that it was real. Then they put you in academia to brainwash the youth. That's why they use you on the ABC as the propaganda hand puppet. Who's got their fingers up your ass, David? Right, I have a history here that I can speak very loudly for because I am knowledged enough to be able to put this before the Supreme Court. Eventually, if you were awake enough, the High Court which would see serious war crimes like COVID start to be dealt with. My last and final statement is, you can't martyr a lunatic. You can't believe in an incompetent litigant. And you can't believe in the propaganda of ex-police and the judicial system. You can't believe in the propaganda of the ABC and the Australian government. If this was a true and de jure country, you would be treated very, very different by your public servants than you are today, serving them under pledges to that government instead of oath of allegiance in accordance with your constitution as subjects of the crown and not citizens of a nation state. So have fun. That was a nice lengthy video where I kind of had to go and rebut the claims made by these academic idiots and awaken you to the fact that there is a truth out there that 99.9% of you aren't even close to seeing yet. What would happen if 15% of you awakened to the fact that God, King and country formed the foundations in your constitution and they were your avenue out of this slavery? Have fun. That was a really difficult video to put together. It's one of those videos that you could have made a coffee and listened to, because I don't appear and I don't do anything except explain the propaganda machine at work.